Okay, so let me invite all the speakers to the front, please, to the table. So now the idea is to have difficult questions for them and to make them answer. So just to start things moving, let me ask 2 questions to them. The first one is on asymmetry of information. So we have been looking at Doha, why it didn't work, although there were several works showing that the impacts of Doha were positive. So why this asymmetry of information? The second one on similar on excessive volatility and policies imposed by countries. These are new things. If you look at books on the 70s, these type of policies were also implemented. So what is different now? So how you perceive that your book will make a difference if you did in the past? And how you can resolve this asymmetry of information, or there was a lack of solid evidence in those days, and now you have the solution to everything. And the second one, more linked to beautiful and ugly. So everything David showed was how beautiful trade is and how amazing it could be, but what is the bad side of it? So people are not crazy, so why they're afraid about trade? Why they're against it? What is the rationale behind, and what you are bringing to show that that is not necessarily the case. So with that, let me open for questions. Yes, Rob. So by the way, Rob Voss is the new director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at IFPRI. So welcome, Rob, to IFPRI.
Thank you. Do I need a microphone or can I speak like this? Thank you. First of all, David and Antoine and all the co-authors, congratulations. I just started here 3 days ago, so I didn't have a chance to go through it, but it looks like a very impressive piece of work, as also others have commended. I would like to raise a question which links up to something which David said and something that Antoine said. When I did ex-ante impact assessments of the free trade agreements in Central America about 10-something years ago, some of these perceptions you talked about were very present, because one side of the fence said, well, the free trade agreement will be the best thing that can happen to our country. And the opponent would say, this is the worst, maybe even the root of all evil that can happen to us if we have this agreement signed. And so when we were asked to do this assessment, my first answer was, well, what I would expect to be the impact, I said, well, probably the impact will be very small, because you have already liberalized most of your trades, and what's going to happen in these free trade agreements is not going to change a whole lot, maybe just the association with a big trading partner that comes in. So I think that's also a bit of the point raised of what perceptions people have and don't have a good sense of how big the issue is truly, but also what to expect. And I think first with why the Doha round doesn't show that big welfare effect. If you just look at what will be the change to what's already happened in terms of shifting tariffs and so on, will be not that big. But what the fears, in my view, are of many of the different people inside the fence, or the hopes are, is that trade will do a lot more than just making trading a bit easier. Trading will do more, but basically what dynamic effects will come from it. Like bringing new technology and new investments that will push the economy bigger, or that all of that will do bad things by replacing workers in domestic industries and on farms and so on. So my question is, well, how much of these dynamic effects of trade did you figure into the analysis, and also for the recommendation for the Doha round? As if you look at the new trade agreements, much of the disputes are not so much about what happens to tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but more about what happens to investment, and that relates to the dynamic effect. So the question is, well, whether in the book or maybe as a future agenda, we should not be looking much more at these potential dynamic effects and what's true and what's not true, what's going on.
Okay. Any other question? Yes.
Yes, we all know that there is a new round coming up in Buenos Aires towards the end of. Sorry, my name is Astrid Jacobs from the German Embassy in Washington.
There is a mic, please.
Astrid Jacobs from the German Embassy here in Washington, D.C. So there is a new round within the WTO, a ministerial round coming up in December in Buenos Aires. So what would you recommend to them? What would be the conclusions and where to go work on? And the other question is a little bit inspired. When we talk about agricultural trade, I think basically think of commodity trades and so on. But when you look also at the consumer side, you have more players in the game. You have the industry and especially also the retailers. And you know, from the experience here in the US, I'm coming from Germany, food prices are very low. Food prices here in the US are so much more expensive, especially fresh produce. And I think, what is this, can we capture that? And what is this, what will be the impact for the developing countries? Thank you.
Any other question before we go to the first step? Yes.
I'm Charles Odeyali of Charles Odeyali Foundation. The foundation is both registered here in the US and in Nigeria. My question is, how will you be able to capture the data for what we call informal economy? Because in Nigeria, we have two sets. You have the formal and the informal. The informal, you can't tax it. You cannot even, capture it for you to be able to use it in the national, economic rating. How do you do that to be able to, help the country? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me go back to the panel. Please feel free to answer any of you. So who wants to start?
Okay, so I'm going to start. Thank you for your question and thanks for your comments. I will react to a couple of them if I have time. But I will first focus on the questions, at least some of them, because I'm pretty sure the panel will have additional information. The first one about asymmetry of information. I think that it's a reality that, unfortunately, most of the things we do in applied economics we poorly capture, because the world is just a big nest of asymmetry of information at every level, between policymakers and the industry we try to regulate or support, between the players in the negotiation, between the different market entities competing, and so on. So, trade and perfect competition is great if information is here, if there is transparency, and that should be a key goal for policymakers to promote this transparency, to provide more information, and to reduce asymmetry of information. That's the theory. In practice, there are also players of the game. They don't want to give all the information to the other party in a negotiation. They don't want to give all the information to their constituency that can complain about the fact that, yes, we have made an assessment of an agreement. We know from the beginning that these categories of farmers will lose. As economists, we give it to the policymaker. The first reaction of policymaker is not, let's design something to take care of them. It's, let's not talk about this. And sometimes it creates this fake and false expectation about trade and trade agreement that make the situation worse after. Because we are going to create billions of jobs, or millions, it's already good, and create billions of dollars, but we know from the beginning that trade will not achieve it. Trade is just connecting people. If you don't produce anything, it can help to produce, but it will not be a revolution in itself. Same thing when we signed the round in 1995, to some extent there was a lot of positive expectation, but also promises. Look, we have given this to developing countries, both in terms of what was agreed on and how it has been implemented. It was far from being a big gift for developing countries. They have not been a major winner. Some of them have benefited from the new system, others not. It was part due to asymmetry of information in the negotiation, and 10 years after, 20 years after, it created problems. Because you have some of these countries saying, oh, we are not going to sign against something, because last time we didn't get what we were thinking we would get. So, that's an issue, both in terms of how we implement this in terms of our analysis, how the world has to try to reduce this asymmetry of information by providing different public goods, both research, both information on prices, on different volatility, on understanding why prices are increasing, for instance. It's very different to know if, because it's something we understand, and like a climate shock, or a big flood in part of the world, or because some people are hoarding and trying to manipulate prices. And thanks to the work you have done here, also this is another part of what IFPRI is doing to alert that. But the last point on asymmetry of information, I think it's we are still designing policies like 50 years ago, when all the improvement we have done in terms of designing contract based on asymmetry of information, finding new policies with self-screening of people and things like this is not really implemented. We have a lot of now theoretical corpus and even experimentations, and we can do smarter policy, more complex, but taking into account that you will never know the cost of the industry you try to regulate, and they will always try to cheat you. So don't try to spend too much information in checking things, just provide policies that will self-select them. In the world, there are very few cases of that. Same thing in terms of how we do with trade negotiation, in terms of discipline. Let countries self-select themselves, but we need to design the rules in this sense. That's what the most advanced, even more recent Nobel Prize in economies are working about, but in the applied field, this is not something the policymakers have done yet. About why people are afraid about trade, I think that the overall rule is that people are afraid about something that is far, foreign, and competition. Trade is all about this. We want competition to improve the system, to challenge what we are used to do by using new technology, by potentially a new taste, testing new things, and we like it. But also it's very natural part of mankind to say, okay, if it's come from another country, it may be worse than my country. And policymakers like to feel on this. It's very easy to sell. And hopefully there is other people trying to promote something different. But in terms of trade dynamics, yes, there is this dynamic gain of trade. The problem is how we assess them, how we capture them, because it depends a lot of governance. You can have the same trade agreement with a government providing the right set of institutions, of rules, of infrastructure that will be a revolution in the country. And we have seen in some of them, when they join WTO, they are going to reduce their tariff maybe by 2-5%. But there is a package of reform, sending signal to private investors, things are changing. Now my government is going to follow rules and not just be an autocratic entity. In other countries, the same trade agreement will not have this if people say what the government has signed will never be applied. So this is this case-by-case challenge of the implementation. About what is coming in Buenos Aires, of course at IFPRI we have other people working on trade, and with my colleague Valeria here, we are working on what we can do in Buenos Aires. One of the questions is, who will be ready to give something in Buenos Aires, and today what the US will do, my other colleague will have thinking about this, because you still need the big players to be committed to deliver something. Even if we want to have everyone participating, and we can discuss the modalities of curatorial and multilateral, if the big guys doesn't want to make some concession and help to move the train, we stay at the station. But see, what we can do is basically maybe to revisit some rules about farm policy. As Antoine has said, things have changed about how policies are implemented. The chapter of David Orden and chapter of Joe Glover also discussed this new instrument, are they WTO compatible? Do we need to adjust rules? Do we need to adjust rules to take care of this problem of volatility, how to manage it? But maybe more important, we are dealing with different set of countries. During the regular round, people were not caring so much about what India and China will do. They didn't have so much money. They were not deeply involved in world markets. Now they are. So revisiting domestic support and finding basically and accepting the idea that there is different speed at the WTO. That we cannot consider that India is a developing country as Cameroon. That's a big mental revolution for people, but de facto that's the situation. They don't have the same impact on world market. They don't have the same access to technology and so on. So how we can manage this multi-speed and to have a more flexible system to take into account new rules on domestic support can be a huge improvement if it is reached in Buenos Aires.
Thank you, David. Antoine?
Yes, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Michael, for your intervention. They were very interesting. Kim, yes, there are two ways of now considering the trade negotiations. Small is beautiful approach, that is to say small packages negotiated each year. could be a way to do it, but I think it's a pity because I think that the best approach in terms of efficiency, of course, economic efficiency, would be to completely revamp the negotiations, because the point of departure of the negotiations has completely changed, as David just said. We think, yes, the reinforcement of WTO rules is very, very important, and you're right that in particular we have to update them, so it's a type of reinforcement. And the plurilateral approach, yes, I mean, it's the opposite idea of the multilateral principle. But I mean, we try to do something in terms of modeling in order to understand why the negotiations have failed. And one of the big problems is this consensus rule, which imposes that everybody must agree. And if all the countries except one agree, the round is not concluded. So I mean, it's a big problem. So, but I think that the best directions for that is to extend the domain of negotiations, to have something which is a balance between what happens in services and what happens in industry and what happens in agriculture, and not what happens right now, which is more separate negotiations. And of course, implementing side payment, for example, through aid for trade or things like this. Michael, thank you very much for your comment. I try to explain to my family and my friends that during food shortage we should let prices go up and production, local production being exported. It's very difficult. But I have big arguments with all of them. But yes, we think that, for example, concerning the food security at the household levels, the problems is that incomes are insufficient. It's not that prices are too high, because prices are too high. This is good to encourage new productions, while the problems for households is that their incomes are insufficient, are not sufficient enough. So we have to complement them by transfers, cash transfers or in-kind transfers. So we think that is the best policy. I just want to say that the bad side of trade, yes, for example, if you take the example that we have in introductions like quinoa, it's true that quinoa is a successful story in Peru and Bolivia, but in particular it has considerably reduced poverty in the rural areas, and of course it has also contributed to better diets in importing countries. So this is a wonderful side of international trade, but at the same time it had, I think, bad effects on poor in urban areas in countries like Bolivia, because the price of food has increased, because the price of quinoa, for example, has massively increased. So I mean, what I try to explain each time I'm trying to support free trade is the fact that there is always a bad side of trade, and this is why the negotiations are difficult, and this is why trade liberalizations has to be accompanied by redistributive policy, like fiscal policies, like transfer policies, in order to compensate the losers from international trade. Informal economy. This is a big problem, in particular in Africa. We are working on that with the USAID support, and we are trying to evaluate, in fact, the informal trade. That is to say, international trade that is not recorded by balance of payment statistics. It's very big in some parts of Africa. And it means that we have to correct, in fact, the statistics by the amount of this informal trader. I think that in specific years in Uganda, it's more than 50% of formal trade. So it's really big. For example, there are some initiatives, so it is not systematically evaluated, but there are some works, some studies working on that. And it's of course also problems for domestic statistics, not only international trade. and we try systematically to correct this, but we do not have enough information. So the DOA is unfinished business, but our work is also unfinished business.
Thank you, Edward. Kimberly, you have any? No? Michael?
Yeah, so trade agreements are definitely both oversold by their proponents and feared by their opponents. You ask about dynamic effects of trade. This is certainly something that economists have been looking at least since the Uruguay round. So we're aware that trade can stimulate productivity, it can be linked to investment, and so sometimes when we model a trade liberalization, people try to include these things, and it leads you to bigger numbers of the impacts, the overall gains, and maybe sometimes the losses. But what I've observed in maybe 20-odd years of watching economists try to do that is that it doesn't make much difference for the public debate whether you've said that the gain of something is billions or tens of billions, or 0.1% of GDP or 1%. The economists are all thrilled that they've moved the decimal point. But really, what is happening now is that you get a public debate which is focused on the fact that we have these deep agreements now with more rules, and this looks like it's going to continue into the future. The TPP, which I now think is going to live forever because it's become the basis not only for the TPP 11 but for the NAFTA negotiation, had 30 chapters in it, more in every chapter. This is what everybody's doing, and yet when you go and look at public information, you'll find that nobody talks about the tariffs or the disciplines on agriculture. There'll be a couple of issues like dispute settlement or intellectual property, or occasionally it'll be rules of origin, and they'll get that one right, but it will be a couple of, sometimes, from their own private interest. But then other things which are just widely misunderstood then take over, recently I saw somebody giving a TED talk and had up on the slide that the amount of energy required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude larger than what it takes to create it. And this is what we find sadly in a lot of the debate on trade. So I'd love to hear about your shopping experience for fresh fruit in Germany as opposed to in the Washington, D.C. area. And my immediate reaction to that as an economist is that there's a big, long supply chain for food. You've got between the farm and the supermarket or the farmer's market or the local shop, you've got multiple levels of wholesale and retail and distribution which account for a lot of the retail price and which don't necessarily have that much to do immediately with international trade or with the local conditions of production at the farm level. Buenos Aires, it's getting to the point where it's a bit late to give advice. We can watch what they might try to do. I'm hopeful that they'll do something positive on fisheries subsidies. A lot of attention is focusing around e-commerce now, which does have actually something to do with agriculture in some contexts. And I think the WTO has gotten to the point where they find the topic absolutely fascinating, but that they've realized that countries have different interests. Some like to localize data, some don't. Some want to figure out how to tax Amazon, and others don't. And we'll see how that plays out.
Yes,
take
please.
that, just a footnote on the concerns about trade. I mean, one is that in terms of the static effects, they're primarily distributional, right? The net gains are pretty small, and it's all about the redistribution across sectors and workers. And so if you don't have mechanisms in place to help address those losses of of those who will lose from trade, then you're going to have opposition, and they're relatively more concentrated, relatively more vocal. And in the U.S., I think that's been a big problem, that we have lousy safety nets in this country for the most part. And then the second thing that Michael mentioned on the increasingly deep integration in the regional and other trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, there I think negotiators, you're talking about behind the border issues that impact trade but are not directly trade policy. These are domestic regulatory issues to a large degree. And so I think negotiators are going to have to find new, more transparent and accountable ways to address those issues in order to sell them as legitimate to domestic constituents. So those are two things I would highlight in terms of how do we address this backlash on trade.
Thank you so much. So let me open to another round of questions. David.
All right, David Orden, Virginia Tech and formerly IFPRI. I'd like to get the panelists to reflect on this question and see what comments they want to offer. Will the realities of what David I think really called the need for trade, we sometimes call the benefits of trade, but they call this the need for trade. Will those realities save us from the tenor of the current policy debate about trade that's taking place? Now, let me give some examples. I mean, since starting with World War II, there was this broad consensus in the Cold War era that international integration and trade was both good economically, beneficial for countries, and beneficial politically for the West. So that consensus held up for a long, long time. And even when this book was being written, I think we would have said that was still the center of gravity. And on the far left and on the far right, you had critics, and they were at the margins. In the end, the center would come together and majorities would hold for that post-World War II consensus. That tone has been blown apart in those last 2 years. And so if we're right, it's not just information asymmetries, it's also the reality of what's happening. So if we're right that trade is beneficial, and this is what the post-World War II system had to deliver, it had to deliver some benefits that people somehow felt no matter what the language was. So there's my question. Will the realities of the benefits of trade save us from the tenor the trade policy debate has taken on? Another example of these realities, the shift in domestic support policies by both Europe and the United States from the old days when they build up stockpiles of grains, then they take land out of production to keep the stockpiles from building up. I mean, the shift away from those policies is actually remarkable. And it's going to happen in China and other places too, not because of the arguments we make, not because of our empirical evidence, but because of the empirical realities that these things just were impossible to administer. The costs, the stockpiles sitting on the ground, the cost of that, all those realities led to these shifts in policy. So there's just one example of the realities saving us, in a sense, or moving us from a worser set of policies to a better set of policies. So in the context of the current trade debate, I'd like to have the editors and commentators reflect on this book, and from this book, what does it have to say about that question?
Thank you, David. Any other question? No? So, if not, I have one. Oh, yes, please.
Hello. My question is whether, and talking about climate change that creates...
Sorry, what is your name? And from
sorry. My name is Juan Jose Egas, and I work for the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. And my question goes regarding climate change and all these kind of shocks that create food shortages for that impact the developing countries and developed countries as well. My question goes on the way of how these shocks should be taken into account on the shaping and reshaping of the institutional framework of world trade.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, Will.
Will Martin. Wonderful book. Thanks guys. What's happening now is the share of world trade in agriculture that's between one industrial country and another, and hence subject to the full set of rules, is very small. It's maybe 20%. It'll rise a little when the UK leaves the EU, and you'll get more trade subject to WTO rules. But it's still going to be very small, and the real action is going to be in that trade that involves developing countries, where only partial set. And I think, David, you made the point that India and Angola are quite different. But how it's always proved very difficult to differentiate developing countries. What prospects do you see for recreating the rules to allow for that important asymmetry between between India and Benin?
Thank you. Any other question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Krishna, and I'm doing MPA at Maxwell School, Syracuse University. So my point is about the agricultural sustainability. So in terms of Indian case, so how the cash transfers can actually change the agriculture trade and its sustainability in that particular country.
Thank you. Any other? So let me ask my question, and then we pass to them because I have to ask. So I still don't buy in your story of asymmetry of information. And for me, the issue is short-term and medium-term and long-term. So what are the discount rates? So for example, I can put policies that will have a huge return for me in the short-term, like tax, export bans, and so on and so forth. If I'm a politician, and I am one of those policymakers, I will get a huge return because people will have more food, but in the medium term they will be affected. The same with India's subsidies to water, for example, for pumping. So how you are taking into account the intertemporal allocation and the discount rates in the different players that are part of your general equilibrium framework when you work with your general equilibrium models. So thank you. Back to you. Please, you have around 2 minutes each, and good luck. Who wants to start? Kimberly, you want to start?
I was take a stab on partially answering David's question about sort of the tenor versus the benefits. And I think what we've seen so far with the Trump administration is that while talking big, they actually haven't done a lot of what they threatened, at least so far. And I think globally, I know there are differences over how much of increase in protection there's been since the financial crisis. I view it as that there really hasn't been that much rolling back, but I don't expect much going forward. And I don't know quite how, if that's a stable equilibrium. That's what I see for sort of the short to medium run. But if it's an unstable equilibrium, do we eventually really go backwards and really start to unwind things, or do we find a way forward? And I hope it's the latter, but I don't pretend to know.
I'm pretty close to Kim on this. I think there's a big market to listen to politicians talk about blowing up the world, but a very small market for actually blowing up the world. And if we are now at the end of this 70 years of post-war liberalization, and when you look at the Brexit negotiations and the NAFTA renegotiation, you find that there are whole sets of institutions and market relations built around the post-war liberalization, and people have gotten used to the fact that there's a working North American supply chain in autos, and they've gotten used to the fact that there's a large financial agglomeration in the city of London, and so on and so forth, things that if one seriously proposes to change arrangements to make these things not work, you get a very big pushback. So I do see that equilibrating effect there.
Yeah, about asymmetry of information. In fact, we do not integrate this problem in general equilibrium model because it requires data that we do not have. But in fact, we work on that with David because we think it's a very important element of trade and trade policy, but it's in theoretical work, that is to say, we do not try to calibrate this data. We see asymmetry of information as a problem because, in fact, governments want to redistribute incomes between agents, and for doing that in an optimal way, they have to know private information. they have to get private information. For example, between farmers, they have to know the cost of productions of each farmers. And the problem is this private information. And so it means that it biases policies. And so it changes the level of productions and it affects trade and it affects also trade policy. We see it also as a problem between negotiators because in fact negotiators when they try to gather at WTO and try to exchange concessions, they do not know the degree of pressure of the other negotiators. And so it means that the best way you have to negotiate is to lie about the domestic pressure that you've got at home in order to get more from the other negotiators. And it means that it can make the negotiations impossible because everybody lies. So this is the kind of way we see the problems of asymmetry informations. But I think you're right, it's a very big problem in international trade and trade negotiations.
Yes, I will follow up on this point, but also link it to some other issues. So, yes, something we have to maybe repeat explicitly, that agriculture has something specific compared to the sector is this variability in terms of productivity coming from weather. And with climate change, this can increase. So both private and public policies have to do risk management in a more effective and advanced way in agriculture than if you produce shoes. There's also some risk in your value chain, but they are different in nature. So this is why we want a different set of disciplines to tackle this. Now, the issue is, depending what you really want to do as a policymaker, both in terms of time horizon, so here your issue of discount rate matters, but also in terms of intertemporal consistency. And that we want discipline is to make sure that in time of crisis, policymaker doesn't make things worse. Many people, not only policymakers, in time of crisis take decisions too quickly, not based on evidence, and make the wrong decision at the most critical time. If you're in a car, you have a car accident. If you are on food market, you have a food price crisis, and so on. So we want this discipline. And this is the story of Ulysses when he's going in his adventure. And basically, you know, they are going to meet the sirens, and the sirens with their song will call him, he will jump in the water and he will die. So what he asks him, what his sailors is, please tie me to the main mast of my ship. So today I take decision to reduce my freedom later on. Because I know that in time of crisis, I will jump and I will die. So today I want this agreement that has this discipline. And if you are smart enough like Ulysses, you take this. Not all policymakers and not every people is like Ulysses. That's why we don't write about them 2,000 years after. I will conclude about this long-term perspective. I agree that because we have created so much linkages, it's very difficult now to break the system. But also if you look at 2,500 of history, we have been in era of very strong integration, very strong linkages. And as soon as you start to erode some of these linkages, you weaken step by step the system. And 10 years after, 20 years after, you have created some weakening of the system that allow the new generation of people to break it. And my main concern is that it's human capital for policymakers. People that have known the Second World War know the value of having European Union and peace. People that have known the food price crisis of the 70s know the value of the merry-go-round. 20 years after, 30 years after, a new generation of policymakers come and they forget, and they reinvent the wheel. We can do public stockholding. It's so great. Why we are not think about it before? Yes, you have thought about it, you have implemented it in the 70s, and in some of the countries where you want to implement it again, it was a major failure. So some advanced economy, not in terms of GDP per capita, but knowledge, have this institutional knowledge, this cultural thing that make that policymakers learn over time, and what you have built in my generation is not lost. But you have a rate of decay, and in many countries when you have not this reaccumulation of knowledge, people forget, and they do the mistake 50 years after, and we have seen it for the last 2,500 years of human history. I have a graph about this.